So, a few weeks ago, something pretty fun happened. Davey Reedon, co-creator of the Stanley Parable, tweeted out a picture from his newest game, October 2015's The Beginner's Guide. The picture looks like this. And because I originally intended to include the Beginner's Guide in my video on autobiographical games, I had the same image in the little collage frame with pictures from Sibel and That Dragon Cancer. So, I responded to Reedon's tweet with a picture of the picture on my wall. And he tweeted back to say it was cool. And I celebrated internally because someone whose work I really admire had recognized me. But then I remembered, this isn't the first time that Davey Reedon said my shit was cool. Back when I was at OSU, there was this cool group called the English Undergraduate Organization, and at one point, they held a series of events discussing indie video games. So, on February 28th, 2014, they held an event where we all got together, we played the Stanley Parable, and then Davey Reedon did a Skype interview with us. He approached our questions with equal humor and insight. He was great, but unfortunately his internet didn't allow him to do video. Our camera, however, was still on, so it was this intimidating large blue screen with humans approaching one by one to ask for its judgment, and it became this fun running joke. When I had my turn to ask him a question, I led with, "All hail the blue screen," and, well, I recorded it, so you can listen. All hail the blue screen.
The blue screen will submit to your questions. I'm sorry, I'll stop doing this. This is like really not. Yeah.
I thought it was cool.
Thanks, man. The blue screen thinks you're cool.
All of this is to say that Davey Reedon definitely thinks I'm cool. And I think the Beginner's Guide is cool. So cool that for months I planned to analyze it and make it the subject of my first video back from that long break. Then Camster made a beautiful, super insightful episode of Errant Signal about the game, and it kinda lit a fire under me, because for months I sat on my ideas without acting, and then somebody more motivated came along and did what I had put off doing, and he killed it. If you're interested in the game, or maybe you've already played it, I wholeheartedly recommend checking out Camster's excellent video. My analysis, however, will be a little different. I want to incorporate pieces of that old interview into an exploration of what the game might mean to Davey Reedon. And oh yeah, I'm going to spoil everything. Let's get started. In my last video I talked about the games Sibel and That Dragon Cancer. Of course, feel encouraged to go check that video out. It's linked here and in the description. In that video, I presented those games as two examples of the same model. Autobiographical games that ask you to step into someone else's, the developer's, shoes and understand their stories. We play in the first person as these characters, but their humanity, their reality, means that there's an ever-present awareness that this is not about me. It's a little jarring, to be honest. So many games say, "You are Master Chief," but these games say, "This is Nina," and I'm not Nina. Ultimately, this jarring reaction is fruitful. It's enlightening to confront that separation, to learn stories that aren't like my own. But the separation is there. Of course, the model presented by Sibel and That Dragon Cancer isn't the only model of autobiographical fiction in games. The Beginner's Guide, narrated by developer Davey Reedon, is ostensibly autobiographical as well.
Hi there. Thank you very much for playing The Beginner's Guide. My name is Davey Reedon. I wrote The Stanley Parable, and while that game tells a pretty absurd story, today I'm going to tell you about a series of events that happened between 2008 and 2011. We're going to look at the games made by a friend of mine named Coda. Now, these games mean a lot to me. I met Coda in early 2009 at a time when I was really struggling with some personal stuff, and his work pointed me in a very powerful direction.
But it works that autobiographical angle in a very different way. As explained by Davey himself, The Beginner's Guide is a collection of games. The games were made by Davey's colleague Coda over a 3-year period before going absent, and Davey walks us through the games, interpreting them and recounting the two developers' relationship as he goes. Through his interpretation of Coda's work, Davey thinks he can gather some understanding of Coda.
This is what I like about all of Coda's games. I mean, not that they're all fascinating as games, but that they are all going to give us access to their creator. I want us to see past the games themselves. I want to get to know who this human being really is. And that's exactly what we're going to do here.
In the other autobiographical games I've discussed, the player goes through the motions of a true past tense story. In the beginner's guide, the story is happening in the present tense. More than being about Coda and his games, the beginner's guide is about Davey telling you about Coda, his games, and the motifs throughout, like the door puzzle and the lamppost. And indeed, you are being told. You. The game doesn't ask us to assume any role other than that of video game player. Instead of saying, this is an event from my life, the beginner's guide simply says, this is a video game. Destructoid's Darren Nakamura points out that by foregrounding the fact that it is a video game, the beginner's guide comes off as extremely honest and engaging. That medium transparency and candor leads us to trust Davey's narration. But, through little hints escalating to the game's conclusion, we learn that maybe our narrator isn't so trustworthy. Over the course of the beginner's guide, Davey announces that he has altered some of Coda's games. In Coda's first proper game, Escape from Whisper, Coda includes a maze. Finding no reason for it, Davey teleports the player past it in the interest of time. In Nonsense in Nearly Every Direction, Coda slows the player to an absolute crawl. For the sake of time and playability, Davey modifies the game. Pressing Enter allows the player to regain normal walking speed and scale a massive stairway to a warm, inviting room full of game ideas. And in The Great and Lovely Descent, Coda puts the player into a prison cell that only opens after an hour of patience. Again, Davey expedites the process to keep the story moving. And all of these things seem forgivable until the climax of the game. It all comes to a head in The Tower, Coda's last game. By the time we reach the tower, Davey has painted a picture of Coda as a horribly troubled intellectual, struggling with depression and creative exhaustion. In this game, Coda creates an impossible invisible maze that screeches every time you contact a wall. To pass the maze and reach the game's conclusion, Davey gives us a bridge and a confession.
And to be fair, it's not like this is the first game that's needed some modification to be playable. Like the house cleaning game. You know, that one used to actually loop the cleaning chores and you just cleaned a house forever. I had to cut it off so that you could exit the house and the game would actually end.
Whoa. He didn't tell us that he had altered that game. So Davey has been dishonest with us. We arrive at a hall with Coda's messages to Davey, one of which directly asks him to stop altering and adding lampposts to the games. In literature, this is called an unreliable narrator. I suppose it's called the same thing in literature or in film or in games, but I want to take a look at the idea. An unreliable narrator manipulates a text. In a novel, that means a narrator whose words and perspective create an incomplete or insincere account of events. But what does that same concept look like in games? Well, I think it means a narrator that manipulates the elements of game design, rules, actions, timers, objects in physical space, as well as the words of a voiceover narration, to misrepresent events. One important element of game design that I just excluded was choice, a central concept in Reedon's previous game, The Stanley Parable. In that aforementioned group interview, after I stopped gushing, I asked a couple questions about The Stanley Parable and if Reedon had played any games that get choice right. Again, I'm a little quiet, but here's the audio.
We talked about how, in the early process of conceiving this game, a criticism of games was central to that. But there's other stuff that's more interesting to you that came out of that. I would love to hear what those more interesting things are in your words, and if you've been playing other games that you think get choice right.
Well, I don't think there's such a thing as getting choice right. I think that there are only compelling explorations of choice, right? And I would rather that we have a lot, like I said, I would rather we have a lot of reference points and that we're able kind of collectively to jump, to swim between them rather than fixating on one and going like, this is it. This is what all games are going to look like from now on, right? I would much, much rather that we did not have the answers so that people continue to try, because as soon as we've got an answer, then that's it. Then we're done. And then it never changes, right?
And in retrospect, I think my question was pretty dumb. But what is the right handling of choice in a game that is centered around an unreliable narrator? In that context, I think the right choice is no choice. It makes a lot of sense that there's virtually no choice in the beginner's guide because we're getting a singular, skewed interpretation of Coda's work. Even further, there's a sense of restricted choice. Like it was there, but now it isn't. Coda's games offered sparing choice, but Davey talks over what little there is or might have been. I think this is perfectly encapsulated by the maze in Escape from Whisper, when our narrator skips over the labyrinth, a metaphor for choice, because he didn't see any reason for it.
Apparently this space station has a labyrinth on it. Sure, I don't know. There's really no reason for it that I've ever been able to discern, so in the interest of time, I'm just gonna skip you on past it. Or, if you'd really like to solve the labyrinth, you're welcome to do that too.
So Davey is thoroughly unreliable in his manipulation of Coda's work. In learning that Davey has been untrustworthy, I think the attention naturally shifts from Coda, our subject, and understanding him through his games, to our flawed narrator Davey. Our narrator is transformed from seemingly candid, caring, and bright to alienating and invasive. But Davey Reedon is a real person. You may notice that I've said Davey a lot thus far in the video. It's not because I'm on a first-name basis with Davey Reedon, but because I want to establish some separation between the narrator in this fictional game, Davey, and the real-life game developer and human that made the game, Reedon. A lot of people jump to analyzing the real Reedon through the beginner's guide. They basically transfer over all the ideas presented about Coda, gathering the impression of Davey Reedon as a depressed, exhausted game developer crying out for help. And it's easy to see why.
I mean, is something wrong with me? Because I know that I did an awful thing, and I'm doing it again right now. Like, I'm showing people your work, but I can't stop myself from doing it. That's how badly I need to feel something again, like I'm an addict. There has to be something wrong with me. Can I apologize? What if I tell you I was wrong? Will that work? Will that fix it? I don't know. I don't think it will, but there's nothing else that I can do. Just tell me what you want. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Please, start making games again. Please help me. Please give me some of whatever it is that makes you complete. I want whatever that wholeness is that you just summoned out of nothing and you put into your work. You were complete in some way that I never was. I want to know I want to know how to be a good person. I want to know how not to hate myself. Please. I'm fading.
But making assumptions about Davey Reedon seems to violate a central lesson of the beginner's guide. Davey didn't and couldn't know Coda through his games. Davey's interpretations and narration told us so much more about him than they did Coda. The game seems to say you can't know the developer through their work, but then it turns around and says, I'm Davey Reedon experiencing an emotional crisis. What do we do? Again, many people do speculate about Reedon's life and mental health. They speculate about Coda's reality and wonder what happened to him. Others, smart critics like Campster, point out that central lesson. They argue, at least in part, that we need to recognize that the beginner's guide is a fiction and appreciate it for what it is. They say that we'd be fools to finish this game and then think we can know Reedon, the real, actual person, through his work. I think this is a very valid critical approach to the game. And yet, it's so tempting to learn nothing from the beginner's guide and wonder about what it says about Reedon. And it's not by accident. Reedon invites that by narrating as himself. Why do that? Why not write an obvious fiction and hire a voice actor to play the role of unreliable game developer narrator? One answer is because the reality is seductive. We like to know about creative people in their lives. And that's why there are tabloids and artist interviews. We want to know how they work. We want to know what makes them special and what makes them human. Leaning on that cultural attraction to artists, it's an effective way to draw people into a story, to engage them, to surprise them with the twists. I have the same attraction. It's the reason I became giddy when a game developer I appreciate tweeted to me. It's the reason I kept an audio recording of that same game developer answering questions about his work. It's the reason I'm willing to arguably ignore one of their game's central lessons in an effort to understand their perspective on their work. So what if we used that stuff, that external material from reading, to bring insight into the game? Maybe that audio recording has something to offer us, some additional explanation of why Reedon would incorporate his own identity into the work like that. Is that okay? Is that a fair approach to take? There are some objections. In the Errant Signal episode on the Beginner's Guide, Camster makes reference to Reedon's Game of the Year blog post, also from February 2014, that expresses Reedon's post-Stanley struggles, and the connections are easy to make. In that post, he talks about an overwhelming pressure to explain his work, the feelings that he's lost control of it, and a craving for external validation. All of these thoughts are in some way reflected by coda or narrator Davey. And again, Camster ultimately argues that to take the things we think we know about someone that we've never met and project them onto the work would mean we're no better than Davey. I mean, that's what he did with coda, literally distorting the work to fit his impression of the author.
And how different from that would I be if I said this game was real-world Davey Reedon processing the experiences after the Stanley Parable? We'd both be making broad proclamations about the mind of an author we've never met. We have to be careful about projecting onto the game's creator a mental state that he or she might not have. We have to recognize that this work may fulfill a completely different role for the real Davey than it does for the audience.
I think that uneasiness with a biographical reading of the Beginner's Guide is both understandable and critically valid. But rather than understanding the author through his work, I want to do the reverse. I want to take all of the interviews and blog posts and use them to explain the game and what it means to Reedon. It would be so easy. I don't think it would lead to any harmful misinterpretations. But some, like literary critic Roland Barthes, reject this sort of interpretation that stems from the words, biography, or identity of the author. In his 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, Barthes laments that the explanation of the work is always sought in the man who has produced it. Barthes writes, "To give an author to a text is to impose upon that text a stop clause, to furnish it with a final signification, to close the writing." In other words, the problem of seeking out the author's meaning for their work is in identifying one correct interpretation, which ends the discussion on potential meanings. The resolution that Barthes identifies is the death of the author. We discard our antiquated, theistic regard for authorial intent, instead interacting strictly with the piece of writing, the text itself. And then infinite interpretations are henceforth discerned by infinite readers in infinite potential contexts. This death of the author begets the birth of the reader. And that's fine, if a little over the top. Barthes also says some things about no writing being original, which I again understand the premise of, but I think are mostly ridiculous. You may have gathered that I'm not a huge fan of the death of the author, but I can concede the main point that once the author's work is done, their text is open to infinite interpretations. I can appreciate that each reader brings their own set of experiences and philosophies to an objective existing work. So various aspects of an artwork can and will have different meanings and greater or lesser significance to each reader. Of course they do. But to me, this more or less agreeable notion of a text's existence apart from its author doesn't preclude an interest in the author's perspective on the work. External materials like interviews and trailers and blog posts put works in context. They inform us on what an author strived to accomplish with their work, and then we can evaluate the success of their formal efforts to achieve those goals. That meta-narrative of creation is interesting to me in considering almost any creative work, but it's especially relevant to the Beginner's Guide, a game about game development and interpretation. So, are you ready? I've gone through multiple arguments now against prioritizing an author's interpretation of their own work, but I still find that stuff really interesting. So let's wind the clock back to February 2014 to get an impression of what Davey Reedon might be looking to do with the Beginner's Guide. During that old interview, Reedon mentioned that his perspective on the Stanley Parable changed a lot over 4 years of development. Initially, the criticism of video games and choice was more important, but over time, and with changes in his personal life, he became less interested in the game's cynical elements. He wanted to make something... Again, I'll let him say it.
I think think that what I didn't realize when I was first making Stanley, and this might seem obvious to a lot of people, but I felt really alone at the time. And then after the game came out, suddenly all of these people are like, hey, we get you. We like this thing that you've made. Come be friends, right? And then suddenly I have friends, right? And suddenly I have people that I really care about and like communities of people that are really important to me. And that wasn't there at first. I really wanted it to be about communication. I really wanted it to be about having to admit your fears and your weaknesses, and to say like all of these things that don't make sense to me about the world, like I'm gonna own those and I'm gonna talk to someone about them, right? Like I'm actually gonna open up to someone about the fact that I feel this way. And in doing that, to be able to like actually connect to other people, right? To actually like let go of that pain. I don't think that the pain is a good thing to focus on. And maybe at the time that I was making the original, I focused a lot on the pain. And that's just not interesting to me anymore. And I'm like, yeah, okay, all right, okay, so all of those questions, blah, 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 does it all matter? Does it, do we mean anything? Are any of us gonna ever, mean any difference with our lives or anything? Like, we have a choice? Well, okay, cool. All right, good. Now what? Right? Like, now, can you actually go and live well? Can you actually, talk to people about the fact that you had all of those, super burning questions that you thought were, really, really meaningful and weighing you down? Can you actually, take that and translate that into, having meaningful relationships? And yeah, that's just way more important to me. To be able to have a conversation, right? And to me, that's more universal than just, it's about games, right? And it is about games. Obviously, it's about games, right? It's clearly about games. But, and also, I wrote the core structure of it, 4.5 years ago, right? So it's you can't change it that much over that long a period of time, right? I'm locked, 4 years out, you're locked into what you started with to some extent. You can't just change it that late in development. Future stuff to be more vulnerable, right? I think Stanley put up a lot of facades and kind of did more sort of kind of posturing and dancing and less, I was pushing more and more over time to get it to be more vulnerable, to get it to be more afraid, get it to be more willing to admit its weaknesses. And I definitely think there's a lot of places where it clearly does that in the new version over the original. But still, you can't, at a certain point, it's kind of just adding Band-Aids, right? And what you need to do is say, all right, that's not me anymore, and throw it out and start over with something new and make it more vulnerable this time. That's my goal.
I think that's what the beginner's guide is. It's a story that allows Reedon to share some of his vulnerabilities. The story isn't fact, but the themes, depression, creative exhaustion, and the pressures of authorship are documented as being close to Reedon's mind. Just look back at the Game of the Year post. To me, it's interesting and important to understand the game as Reedon's way of codifying his own vulnerabilities and experiences from developing the Stanley Parable. But understanding the beginner's guide as Reedon's expression of his struggles doesn't stop it from also being relevant and evocative in all sorts of different contexts. Consider non-gaming people. While Reedon might use the game to share his most personal feelings, the emotional themes are universal. Who can't connect to the experiences of loneliness, of envy? I know I can. So, if I wasn't familiar with Reedon or the Stanley Parable, and I was completely unaware of how Reedon might consider the game, I would still have those ideas to connect with my own experiences of creative angst. Then consider how the game speaks to critics. In his analysis, Kamster points out an interpretation of the game as extremely hostile towards criticism. If Davey is a kind of pathetic villain for using someone else's creative work to position themselves as good and smart for illuminating it, Well, what does that say about me and critics generally? Yikes. Beyond simply being Reedon's expression of the pains of game development, the Beginner's Guide also functions for me as a mirror to myself, as a critic of games. I take all this time simply to argue that researching and hypothesizing about an artwork's importance to its creator needn't undermine alternate interpretations. Instead, I think that speculation about a work's meaning as the author understands it makes a great jumping-off point for considering how else the work might be interpreted. Indeed, when we identify what an author might think about their work, we don't identify the meaning. We identify a meaning. And all that's left is finding yours. Thanks for watching.
Let me definitively and conclusively state for any and all future purposes and records that my next game will 100% guaranteed to be set on Mars, in hell, or in hell on Mars. I haven't nailed it down yet. It could just come down to a coin toss, or you may not have the funds to play test both. We'll see.
And look at this stupid thing I made. Yeah, that's where we are, but soon, bam. What?